Wyoming Territory, June 6, 1882. The wind carried dust across the empty churchyard, and Florence Fairburn stood in her white dress, watching the road where her groom had promised he would ride from. He did not come. The chapel, built by hand with timber from her father's land, was full of whispers. Neighbors shifted in their pews. Her aunt clutched a handkerchief. Her younger brother, 15 and wide-eyed, kept glancing toward the door. But Florence kept her eyes on the horizon, her heart refusing to believe the truth even as her mind started to understand it. "Maybe he's just late," someone murmured behind her, but she knew. Nathan McCrae was gone. She had sewn the hem of this dress herself. She had fed the chickens at dawn, cleaned the barn, and still found time to tuck lilacs in her hair. She had believed in him. He had told her he would build them a cabin by fall, that they would raise horses, that she would never have to carry water alone again. He had lied. Florence's knees began to shake, but she refused to fall. She would not cry in front of them. She turned from the altar, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides, and then the door opened. A man stepped in, dusty from the trail, his hat in his hand. He was tall, lean, with a sun-browned face and eyes the color of storm clouds. Every person in the room turned to look. Florence blinked. He was not her groom, but something about him made her breath catch. He looked at her, straight at her, and something in that gaze steadied her. "I am sorry to interrupt," he said, voice low, rough from dust and miles, "but I heard a woman was being left at the altar." "And I could not let that stand." Murmurs rose. Florence's aunt gasped. The stranger looked at her again, like she was something worth standing up for. "My name is Kellan Rowe," he said. "I work cattle on a ranch west of the river. I do not know what promises he made. But I will marry you today if you will have me." Florence stared at him, her heart beat loud in her chest. He was serious, not a grin on his face, no mockery, just quiet, steady courage. She should have said no. She should have walked out, let the gossips talk, let the shame roll off her back. But something in her moved, something deep and desperate and brave. "You do not even know me," she said. "I know you deserve better than being left behind," Kellan answered, her fingers tightened around her bouquet. She looked to the preacher, who stood frozen behind the altar. Her lips trembled. She stepped forward. "I am Florence Fairburn," she said, "and if you mean what you say, then yes, I will marry you." The church fell silent. They married right then. The preacher's hands shook as he took their vows, his voice unsteady. Kellan's hand was warm and firm in hers, his thumb brushing hers once, gently. He said the words clear and sure. Florence's voice cracked, but she got them out when it was done. The preacher pronounced them man and wife, and the church erupted in stunned applause. They walked out into the sun together, strangers, husband and wife. Florence did not know what came next, but she knew she would not face it alone. The wagon Kellan drove was plain and worn, pulled by a sturdy bay. He helped her up with a quiet, "Careful now," and guided the reins as they rode away from the chapel, leaving behind the whispers and the dust. They rode for hours. Kellan spoke only when she asked. She learned he was 29, had worked cattle since he was 13, and had no family left. He had been on his way into town to collect supplies when he heard talk at the mercantile about a wedding gone sideways. "I could not let it go," he said simply. Florence, still in her white dress, watched the prairie roll by. The sun was low when they reached his land, modest but clean. There was a barn, a well, and a small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. "You live alone?" she asked. "I do." She hesitated at the door. He saw it. "I will sleep in the barn if that is what you need," he said. She looked at him, saw no pressure in his face, only respect. She nodded. "Just for tonight," she said. He gave her a small nod and carried her trunk inside without another word. That night, Florence lay in the narrow bed staring at the ceiling. Her wedding dress hung over the door. Her hands were still trembling, but not from fear, from something else. Something warm that had started in her chest when Kellan held her hand in that church and had not let go. By the next morning, she was up before dawn. She found the flour, the eggs, the skillet. She made biscuits and eggs and brought them out to the barn. Kellan stood by the corral, brushing down a mare. He looked up, surprised. "I thought I would feed my husband," she said, holding out the plate. His eyes softened. He took it. "You did not have to, I know." He ate standing beside her. The wind picked up her hair and she tucked it behind her ear. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I did not do it for thanks," he said. "I know that too." They stood in silence, watching the sun rise over the prairie, and something settled between them, not love, not yet, but a beginning. A quiet understanding, and it was good. The days that followed passed without ceremony. Florence kept her apron on through supper and wiped her hands on her skirts without thinking. Kellan never asked her for anything he didn't need to. He worked the land like someone who had no use for words unless they carried weight. She found that kind of silence oddly restful. On the third morning, she rose before the light and stepped outside. The air smelled of dew and ash. She found Kellan already at the woodpile, splitting logs with a steady rhythm that echoed across the yard. "You always start before sunup?" she asked, stepping closer. He set the axe down and leaned on the handle. "Only way to keep ahead of the work." "I could help," she offered. His brow lifted slightly. "You ever split wood?" "No," she said. "But I've swung a hoe through dry earth and hauled milk in winter. I imagine it's not all that different." He didn't laugh. He just stepped aside and handed her the axe handle, careful to place it in her grip with a kind of quiet gentleness that surprised her. She missed the first strike, glanced up, and saw he wasn't judging. Only waiting. By the fourth swing, the log cracked. He gave a single nod. "You learn quick." That night he sat across from her at the table while she peeled turnips. His hand, wrapped in a strip of cloth, rested against the edge of his plate. "What happened to that?" she asked, not looking up. "Colt kicked," he said. "Had a stone under his hoof." "I pressed too hard. You should have told me. I could have cleaned it properly." "I rinsed it in the creek." She set the paring knife down. "That's not the same." He studied her face a moment, then pushed the plate aside and offered her his hand. She unwrapped it slowly, careful not to tug the cloth. The cut ran across the palm, shallow but red at the edges. "You kept working like this," she murmured. "There's no one else to do it." "I'm here now." He didn't reply, but his fingers curled slightly in her hand before she let go. Later, after the dishes were stacked and the lamps turned low, she stood by the window while the wind pressed against the shutters. "You've been alone a long time," she said softly, not turning around. "I got used to it. I don't think I ever will." He stood from the chair, boots scuffing the floor, and came to stand beside her. "You don't have to," he said. She turned to face him. "I didn't say I wouldn't try." He nodded once, then stepped back toward the door. "I'll sleep in the loft again." She didn't stop him, but that night she folded the quilt at the foot of the bed and placed it near the hearth, just in case the wind got in through the cracks. When she lay down, she kept her eyes open longer than usual. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee already brewing. When she stepped into the kitchen, Kellan was setting a plate of cornmeal cakes on the table. "You don't have to cook for me," she said. "I know," he answered, "but I figured you might like a morning off." She sat down slowly. "What's the occasion?" "Fence lines down on the north side. I'll be gone most of the day." "I can walk the west line while you're out," she said. He picked up his hat. "You don't need to prove anything." "I'm not," she said. "I just don't like sitting still." Something passed through his eyes, then not surprise, not doubt, more like recognition. "All right," he said, "but take the rifle. There's a cougar that's been sniffing around the gulch trail." She nodded, already reaching for her boots. He paused in the doorway. "You always this steady?" She looked up. "Only when I don't have the choice not to be." He looked at her a long moment, then tipped his hat and stepped outside. The door closed gently behind him. She found the broken fence before noon, just past the line of box elders where the land began to slope toward the creek. The post had rotted through at its base, and one rail lay half buried in last season's runoff. Florence crouched, brushing dirt from the splintered wood, and took stock of what she'd need to set it right. By the time she returned with a replacement post and the hand saw, the sun had swung high and the air buzzed with horseflies. She worked with her sleeves rolled, sweat darkening the fabric at her back until the new rail fit snug between the uprights. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold. As she stood, wiping her palms on her apron, a breath of wind moved through the grass, bringing the scent of something dry and sharp smoke. She turned toward it. It came from south of the ridge, thin and gray, rising in a single thread against the blue. She watched it a long moment, then swung the rifle over her shoulder and started walking. It wasn't far. Half a mile, maybe less. The trail narrowed as it climbed, a scattering of deer tracks pressed into the soft earth. When she crested the hill, she saw him. Kellan crouched by a fire no bigger than a skillet, cooking something in a dented tin pan. His coat had been set aside, his sleeves pushed up, and his hat rested beside his boot. He looked up when she stepped into the clearing. "Fence is patched," she said. He stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I figured you'd still be out. Didn't expect you to come this way." I smelled the fire. He nodded once and moved aside, giving her room near the warmth. "It's Rabbit. Trapped him this morning." She sat, crossing her legs beneath her, and accepted the plate he offered. The meat was lean, tough, but the salt he'd used made it bearable. "You sleep much last night?" she asked. "Enough," he said. Then, after a pause, "There was a storm a few years back. Took the roof clean off this hill. I used to camp here when I had to ride night watch. Something about it still feels steady." She glanced around. The trees were young, their trunks thin, reaching for sun. "You didn't fix the roof." "No point." "Just me out here." She chewed slowly, then set the plate aside. "You ever think about leaving?" He didn't answer right away. "I did once, when my brother died. Thought maybe I'd go east, find a rail job, but I couldn't leave him behind. He's buried up near the cottonwoods under that flat stone." Florence looked at him, the lines around his mouth drawn tight in the quiet. "Was he younger?" 2 years, Kellan said. "Meaner than a bull and twice as loud. But he stuck by me when everything else went sideways." She didn't ask what sideways had meant. The way his voice dropped said enough. "I'm sorry you lost him," she said. He nodded, not looking at her. "You ever think about leaving?" She drew her knees up, arms around them. "Once. After my mother died, I wanted to see Kansas City or maybe Omaha, but then my father leaned harder on the bottle and I couldn't leave my brother with that." He glanced at her. "You still think about it?" She shook her head. "I've seen enough miles to know there's not much different out there. Just more of the same with different names." They sat for a while, the fire crackling between them. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, he stood and stamped out the coals. She helped gather the pan, the tin cup, his coat. He didn't offer to carry her rifle. He'd seen her shoot once, a rabbit clean through the eye, and hadn't said a word about it. As they walked back, the sky turned soft with dusk. The land stretched quiet around them, the kind of silence that settles into the bones. "Florence," he said, once the cabin came into view. She stopped. "I know we started something strange, and I don't expect you to feel anything you don't. But if you ever do, if there's a day when you look at me and see more than what I offered in that church, I'd be proud to be more than a name in your ledger." She looked at him, her face unreadable in the fading light. "I'll know when that day comes," she said. "And when it does, I'll tell you myself." He nodded once, and they walked the rest of the way home without another word, but when they stepped inside, she didn't go straight to the bedroom. She took down a second plate and set it beside hers. By the time August settled in, the heat came in waves that shimmered along the ridge and turned the fields to brittle gold. The well pump groaned with each pull. The chickens panted in the shade of the lean-to, and Florence kept her hair braided tight to keep the sweat from her neck. She and Kellan had slipped into a rhythm not born of agreement, exactly, but of shared necessity. She knew which shirts of his needed mending before he asked. He left the gate unlatched when he went to the far pasture, knowing she'd want to check the calves herself. They moved around each other like two parts of the same cartwheel, sometimes out of step, but always circling the same center. One evening, she sat on the porch steps with her boots off, rubbing the ache from her arches. Kellan came up from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag and squinting into the low sun. "That brindle cow's favoring her back leg," he said. "Might be a sprain. She let you close." "No," he said, "but she didn't charge, so I'll call that progress." Florence pulled her foot onto her lap. "You ever had cattle that weren't half wild?" "Once. Old man in Nebraska bred them near tame, but they wouldn't hold up through winter. Too soft." She glanced at him. "So you trust the wild ones more? They don't pretend to be anything else." She folded her arms across her knees. "I don't think I ever learned how to pretend." He sat beside her, leaving a space between them. I figured that out the day you looked me in the eye and said yes. She picked at a loose thread on her hem. Wasn't sure you'd stay after. I gave my word. Plenty of men give words they don't keep. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his thighs, watching the scrub grass wave beneath the wind. You wanted to ask me something, he said finally. She turned toward him. What makes you say that? You've been watching me like you're measuring lumber for a frame. Florence hesitated, then asked, have you ever been in love before? He didn't flinch. Once. A girl in Dakota Territory. She had a laugh that carried clean across the yard. What happened? She married a banker. Florence nodded slowly. Was it what she wanted? Kellan looked down at his hands. It was what her father wanted. She let the silence stretch. Then, voice quiet, did it ruin you for trying again? No, he said, but it taught me not to mistake kindness for promise. She rested her chin on her knee. That's not what I'm doing, I know. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting shadows across the porch. The cicadas started their hum in the cottonwoods, and somewhere out near the creek, a bullfrog bellowed. Kellan stood and stretched his back. I'll bring in the lantern. You want tea? I'd rather hear you play. He paused in the doorway. I haven't touched the fiddle since spring. You don't have to be good, just honest. He met her eyes for a moment, then disappeared inside. When he returned, the bow was rosined and the strings tuned. He sat on the porch rail and played low, slow reels that meandered like river water. Not polished, not showy, but steady, with pauses where breath belonged. Florence leaned back against the post, her eyes half closed. The music wrapped around her like dusk itself, unspoken and full of meaning. When he set the fiddle down, she said, "It's strange, isn't it? How a thing can feel like home before you've called it that." He didn't move. Is that what this is starting to feel like? She didn't answer with words. Just reached out and rested her hand over his, fingers warm against the ridges of callus and scar. He turned his palm upward and held on. Not tight, just enough. And they stayed like that as the night deepened and the stars came out quiet, side by side, with nothing left to measure. The first frost came during the final week of September. The morning air turned sharp enough to sting the lungs, and the ground cracked thin beneath their boots. Florence stepped out early, shawl tight around her shoulders, and saw her breath floating on the wind like pipe smoke. The garden had withered overnight. She stood over the lettuce bed, brittle leaves curled into themselves like fists. Kellan came up behind her, quiet as always, and crouched to turn a clump of frozen soil in his palm. We'll need to pull what's left today, he said. Before the ground sets for good. She nodded, already kneeling, fingers numb as she began easing carrots from the earth. They worked without speaking. The sky stayed gray all morning, the kind of sky that held back snow without ever delivering it. By noon, the baskets were full, and Kellan had started clearing the last of the cornstalks. Florence took the filled crates into the root cellar. She'd laid new straw down a week earlier, careful to keep things dry and dark. As she worked, she heard the door above her creek open again. I found something, Kellan said, holding out a folded square of yellowing paper. She took it, brow furrowing. Where was it? Between the floorboards in the barn loft, slipped under the beam, looks old. It was a letter, penned in tight, careful script. She read it slowly, lips moving soundlessly. When she finished, she looked up. It's from your brother. Kellan's jaw tightened. I figured. He wrote it for you, said he hoped you'd find it one day, that he was proud of you. That you never gave up when others would have run. He didn't speak, not for a long while. Then, low and even, he carried more than he told me. I should have seen it. You see what you're allowed to see, she replied. Same as anyone. She folded the letter again and handed it back. He didn't take it. Keep it, he said. He'd want someone like you to know the good in him. That night, she placed the letter in a box beneath her sewing basket, beside her mother's thimble and the silver comb she'd brought from home. She didn't ask why he'd never mentioned the letter before. Some things didn't need pulling to the surface. They lived just fine under quiet. 2 days later, he came in after dusk with a gash running down his forearm. The bull calf had panicked during branding and caught him on a nail. She didn't speak as she cleaned it, just poured the whiskey, threaded the needle, and stitched in silence. His skin flinched, but he didn't pull back. "You're steadier with that than most field medics I've seen," he said as she tied off the thread. I learned early. "A broken bottle did worse to my father once. I was 12. He looked at her, eyes darker than the lamplight could touch. "You never talk about him." "There's no use in bitterness," she said. "It rots the same as anything else." After she wrapped the wound, she didn't move to leave. Instead, she rested her hand against the bandage, her touch light. "You would have made a fine doctor," he said. "I wanted that once. But they wouldn't train women, and I didn't have anyone to teach me." "You taught yourself." She didn't reply, but her eyes lingered on his face. He reached up and brushed a curl from her cheek. "You're not just kind, Florence, you're capable, and you deserve someone who sees both." She leaned into the touch without hesitation. "I do." He cupped her face then, his hand rough and warm. She tilted her chin, and when their lips met, it was not rushed or uncertain. It was the kind of kiss that came after knowing, not guessing. That night, she didn't close the bedroom door behind her, and he didn't sleep in the loft again. By the time winter came down hard across the land, they moved as one. She mended his shirts by the fire, and he built her a writing desk from pine. They read aloud most evenings, her voice steady with the poetry she'd brought west in a single book, and he listened with a quiet reverence that made her feel seen in a way no one ever had. He taught her to shoe the horses when the farrier stopped traveling, and she taught him to can preserves when the root cellar grew too full. They argued sometimes softly but honestly, but always ended the day beside each other, hands linked beneath the quilt she'd stitched from scraps of both their pasts. One morning in early April, he brought her a sapling wrapped in burlap. "It's a peach tree," he said. "Won't bear fruit for a few years, but I thought maybe, someday." She knelt beside him in the thawing ground, pressing the roots into the soil. "Someday's a good word." They planted it in the clearing behind the house where it would catch the most light. She named it after her mother. He didn't ask why, he just nodded. Later that spring, they rode into town together. She wore a blue dress she'd sewn from bolts traded with the tanner's wife, and he shaved his beard for the first time since they met. They signed the deed together, his name and hers side by side as co-owners of the land. Folks in town said she'd tamed him. Others said he'd steadied her, but neither word was quite right. They hadn't changed each other. They'd simply given each other room to be whole. When her brother came through that fall, grown taller and surer, he stayed for supper and slept in the barn. He watched them from the porch that evening, his eyes catching on the way Kellan set a hand at the small of her back without thinking. He nodded once, then said, "You look like you belong here." And she did. The following spring, the peach tree bloomed. She stood beneath it with her hands resting on a curve newly forming at her waist, and he came up behind her, arms wrapping around her gently. They watched the blossoms drift down like snow, and she leaned into him, heart full to the brim. "I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again," she said. "You are," he answered. "You're home," and she was. They built their life slow and true, with no need for grand declarations. Just two people who had chosen each other, day after day, in the quiet places where love takes root and grows strong.